Hello everyone and welcome to this week's lecture. This week and next week we will be focusing on violent crimes, and for this week we will be focusing specifically on crimes that are linked to homicides, assault and family violence. So the two main areas that we will cover today, which are homicide and family violence. Assault is not listed as a separate subcategory because it is usually subsumed under either one of these areas. This chart here that was sourced from the FBI's data on the types of crimes that occurred in 2011 suggests that about 62.4%, which is nearly 2/3 of all violent crimes, are actually linked to aggravated assault, meaning assault-related incidences that cause severe injury to the victim. Now, this actually differs from what is usually portrayed in the media, which usually focuses a lot more on homicidal violence, that is, violent crimes that end up in homicide or murder. However, if you look at this pie chart, you will see that homicide accounts for only about 1% of crime in the US, although it appears to be much more than that based on what we see in the media. This doesn't downplay the prevalence of homicide, because even 1% of all crimes is actually a substantial number. Now, however, what the point I'm trying to make here is that homicides are disproportionately portrayed in the media, and this could be due to the seriousness of the crime, but it could also be because producers of films and TV shows know that murder is marketable. It draws our interest and it attracts viewers. The other two types of violent crimes that occur quite frequently in the US are aggravated assault linked to robbery, which makes up about 30% of all crimes, and forcible rape, which is aggravated rape, which makes up almost 7% of all crimes. As mentioned earlier, many criminologists study aggravated assault and homicide together, as they categorize aggravated assault as failed homicides. Now, while the distinction between the two crimes, that is, the distinctions between aggravated assault and homicide, may be critical from a legal standpoint, it is not so critical from a psychological perspective, because much research on offender characteristics from a psychological point of view actually views aggravated assault as failed homicide. While it is important to note that homicide or murder is often categorized together with aggravated assault, they are not categorized together when these crimes are committed by either psychopaths or serial murderers, as both these types of criminals have very distinct characteristics that differentiates them from other criminals who are involved in either homicide or murder. Now, criminal homicide as a crime in itself is defined as an action that causes the death of another person without legal justification or excuse. For example, a state executioner who carries out a death sentence either by hanging or injecting a lethal substance into a criminal who has been sentenced to death would not be found guilty of criminal homicide, because although he caused the death of another person, there was actually legal justification for his act. From a legal standpoint, criminal homicide is divided into two main categories. The first is murder. Murder, in a sense, can then be divided into either first or second degree murder. Okay? The definition of first degree murder is homicide that is vicious, deliberate, premeditated, and willful, whereas The definition of second-degree murder is murder that is intentional and unlawful, but without the malice and premeditation required for first-degree murder. Crimes of passion, for example, usually fall under the second category because the act was not premeditated. So the main distinguishing factor between first and second degree murder then is the presence of malice aforethought. Malice aforethought in this case refers to premeditation, that is the mental state of a person who plans and voluntarily causes the death of another without legal excuse or justification. Now, do note that for a murder to be considered to be premeditated, it doesn't actually have to involve weeks of planning. It could even involve just 5 minutes of planning. The second category of criminal homicide is non-negligent manslaughter, and a person is charged with non-negligent manslaughter if he intended the person to die while committing the act, although that may not have been part of his original plan. For example, the perpetrator could have become so agitated or upset in the process of carrying out a crime that he or she lost control of himself, which is why we say there is absence of malice aforethought. This differs from negligent or involuntary manslaughter, where there was no intent to kill, but the law says you should have known your actions could have resulted in another person's death. For example, an act of reckless drunk driving which results in the death of the victim. If we want to define aggravated assault would be defined as assaults or attacks that are carried out with the intention of inflicting serious bodily harm onto another person. These attacks usually involve the use of deadly or dangerous weapons, and deadly or dangerous weapons here would refer to for example, to guns or knives. In some cases, if even somebody using only his fists or his hands to fight, it could still be classified as aggravated assault if the act results in serious injury to the victim. A lot of data that we have on these factors actually comes from the United States because they publish most data on these factors. So here when we talk about demographic factors of homicide, I'm going to refer to data from the US. Within the context of the US, there seems to be key demographic factors that could predict involvement in homicide crime. Involvement here could be involvement as a perpetrator or as a victim. Firstly, in terms of race or ethnicity, African Americans are often overrepresented as both perpetrators and victims of homicide. This could be a reflection of existing social inequalities, for example, due to the lack of education and employment. And therefore, we shouldn't just view them as a result of biological or neuropsychological predispositions. In terms of gender, we know that males represent about 77% of homicide victims and 90% of offenders. That really is a big gender difference. Thirdly, about 50% of those arrested for these kind of violent crimes are usually between 20 to 29 years old. That is, they're usually younger. And finally, we know that poverty can be a significant predictor of involvement in homicide as either a victim or perpetrator. For example, we know that children who are born into disadvantaged neighborhoods and families are more likely to become either the perpetrator or be a victim of homicide. This could be a result of a lack of social support, employment or educational opportunities, or even poor parenting. Now, these are some factors that we had already examined in terms of factors contributing towards involvement in criminal behavior in term 1. Now, do note that the information I presented here is actually based on arrest and not actual conviction or being charged in a court of law. From a psychological perspective, homicide can be categorized into three main areas. The first being general altercations. General altercation homicide is usually the result of hostile aggression, which, as you know, is a form of reactive aggression in response to anger-inducing situations. Now, examples of general altercation homicide could include homicide that is a consequence of real or perceived insults, threats, physical attacks, or even perception of one's own failure. These actions are rarely instrumental in nature and are often instead reactive in nature. Because of this, general altercation homicides are usually referred to as emotionally charged crimes. Many offenders involved in general altercation homicides probably have a strong hostile attribution bias, which makes them more likely to perceive provocations, intended or not, within the environment that they live in and in the interactions that they have daily. In simple terms, what this means is that even the slightest trigger is likely to set them off. Their impulsive behavior could also be a result of high levels of emotional arousal and low levels of self-regulation, which contributes towards their impulsive acts. One of the best protective behaviors in later life against being involved in general altercation homicide is the development of the ability to self-regulate emotions, control impulsive behaviors. It is best that these protective factors are inculcated in children as young as 2 or 3 years old. Second category is felony commission offenders, and usually these offenders are motivated by instrumental aggression, where the offender is motivated to achieve a goal. Therefore, the crimes are usually not emotionally charged but are instead carefully planned. When his or her actions are violent in nature, it is usually referred to as proactive violence. And proactive violence, in this sense, can be defined as cold-blooded, non-emotional, premeditated aggression for personal gain. An example of this would be the act of aggressive assault in the process of committing a robbery. However, usually these crimes, that is aggravated assault during robbery, is only considered to be proactive violence if the offender had actually planned to kill or hurt in the course of committing the crime. If the aggression was unplanned, it is better categorized as reactive violence. Such behavioral tendencies, that is the tendency to become a felony commission offender, usually starts young, when children learn to believe that violent actions will have positive social consequences for them. An example would be when a child believes that he or she has power over his or her victim by bullying them. The third category would be juvenile homicide offenders. Now, the number of juvenile homicide offenders is relatively small. It currently makes up about 9% of the population, 9% of all homicides reported. But that's almost 10% of all crimes, which is quite bad in itself. Of this 9%, 94% of these juvenile homicide offenders are usually male, and most of them were single. It's not surprising they're single, as they are categorized as juveniles, which means they're at least below 18 years of age, if not younger. There is also a gender difference in who they choose to kill. For example, we know that female juvenile murderers are more likely to kill a family member, intimate partner, younger victims, or other females, as compared to male juvenile offenders. Many of these juvenile murderers also have a history of severe educational difficulties, that is when compared to non-violent juveniles, and they especially have problems with language acquisition and expression. They are also likely to have social and cognitive difficulties. In terms of their family background, there is usually low levels of parental monitoring and a high rate of family abuse, often from a very young age. An atypical case involving juvenile murderers that garnered a lot of attention is known as the Dartmouth murders, where two teenagers murdered two professors in their own home. Basically, what happened is that these two teenage boys, James Parker, who was only 16 years old, and Robert Tulloch, who was 17 years old, went in and brutally stabbed two popular professors in their own homes. Friends who were supposed to come over for dinner later found these two professors brutally stabbed in their study, and they were later found to be killed by 7-inch long blades. Now, who were these murderers and why did they do it? Basically, nobody suspected these two boys initially because they were bright students who did well academically and were thought to have normal interests, sports, music, girls. What people didn't realize is that they also were very egoistic and they thought that they were better than everybody else. Their aim was actually to get money, specifically $10,000, so that they could move to Australia and start a life of crime. And their plan was to pretend to be environmental science students who were conducting surveys. And in the pretext of conducting these surveys, they would knock on doors to elicit participants to participate or elicit participation in their study. They had tried once before, but they were deterred because the home that they chose, the person who answered the door actually was not going to be robbed so easily because he had a gun on his own and he threatened to shoot them. So they didn't try anything for 6 months, and then 6 months later they randomly picked these two professors. Initially, the husband who opened the door was hesitant about letting the boys in because he was busy, but he thought that it was his duty as a teacher, or he probably thought was his duty as a teacher to let them in. After listening to a few inept questions, he decided that the boys needed some help to better structure their survey, and so he was going to call somebody who would be able to help these boys. The boys were actually very angered and they became really angry that somebody thought that their survey was not well done, and that led them to brutally stab the professor. And when his wife heard his cries for help and came into the study, they slit her throat as well. If you want to watch the video and find out more about the case, you can click on this YouTube link. It's actually a reenactment of the whole murder. It's quite long, it's about 40 minutes long. So if you don't want to watch the whole thing, that's fine as well. One psychological theory that has been proposed to explain the involvement of youth in such acts is the dynamic cascade model. The dynamic cascade model emphasizes the importance of the dynamic relationship between the individual and multiple social contexts from birth right up to adolescence. It also emphasizes the importance of looking at both nature and nurture factors when trying to understand such behaviors. The model suggests that there are many risk factors influencing antisocial behaviors, and the probability of someone committing homicide is enhanced by the exposure to an accumulation of risk factors over many years. It suggests that each risk factor group enhances the next group along a life course trajectory model in a developmental sequence. For example, the model starts with a child who grows up in an adverse neighborhood. Adverse could be because he is exposed to poverty or violence, or in a family environment with very poor familial conditions, which may include things like parental neglect, growing up in a broken home. His or her parents often feel they need to enhance harsh discipline method, or they need to employ harsh discipline methods to control or guide the child. These disciplinary methods often make it difficult for the child to acquire the social and cognitive skills required for school success. Being unable to perform in school, coupled with the lack of social skills, could result in conduct problems soon after entering school, which could result in both peer rejection due to a lack of social skills and academic failure due to a combination of conduct problems or even literacy problems. The lack of parental presence could result in them associating even more with deviant peers, which then has even more negative influences on them. This then may lead to a persistent lifestyle that involves antisocial and or violent behaviors. While there's been a lot of support for this model, Dodge et al., who initially proposed this model, warned that we shouldn't start labeling children at such an early age. For example, when concluding that an early starting antisocial 5-year-old is destined for a life of persistent crime, this kind of labeling is premature. While they may be at higher risk, it's definitely not certain that this is the route that they will be taking. Labeling them could in fact have the opposite effect and may actually push them even more towards this route. Instead, they suggest that the model that they've proposed be used to provide or to identify specific targeted areas for prevention during specific periods of development. In this next section, we will look at family violence. And in this context, family violence is also sometimes referred to as domestic violence. It refers to actions which may be both violent or non-violent in nature. And crimes that come under this category could include intimidation, battery, sexual assault, sexual battery, or any other criminal offense that results in personal injury or death of one family or household member by another who is residing in the same single dwelling unit. In summary, it covers child abuse, maltreatment, neglect, sibling violence, intimate partner violence, and even elderly abuse. In the US, about 20% of non-negligent manslaughter cases involve a family member, and of these cases, about 50% involves killing a spouse. We also know that the statistics for child abuse or child maltreatment is quite high, where about 1 in 7 children are maltreated at some point. The different categories of child abuse and neglect are summarized in this slide. As you can see, child abuse and neglect can be divided into 6 main categories. Firstly, physical abuse, which is defined as a case where the parent willfully injures or causes injury or allows the child to be injured, tortured, or maimed out of cruelty or excessive punishment. This means that somebody could be charged with physical abuse even if they're not the perpetrator themselves, but allow the child to be victimized by somebody else. The second category, emotional abuse, differs from the third category, which is emotional neglect. Emotional abuse is defined as a chronic pattern of behavior where a child is belittled, denied love, or subject to inappropriate punishment. Inappropriate punishment could be by denying the child affection or love or access to specific resources that may be necessary for him or her. Emotional neglect, on the other hand, is defined as the failure to provide a child with appropriate support, attention, and affection. Therefore, a parent or caregiver who actually attends to all the child's physical needs, such as provision of food and water, clothes, and shelter, could still be charged for emotional neglect. Sexual abuse, on the other hand, is defined as the exploitation of a child or adolescent for another person's sexual and controlled gratification. The fifth category, child neglect, is defined as the chronic failure of a parent or guardian to provide a child with their own basic needs. These basic needs could be things like shelter, food and water, or proper clothing. The final category is missing or exploited children, where a child is kidnapped from his or her parent or guardian for either the purpose of abduction, for example, ransom, or to exploit the child either through physical labor or sexual abuse. One of the previous slide, sexual abuse and sexual exploitation of a child, lesson to another person's control gratification. One particularly disturbing type of sexual abuse that has been uncovered recently is the exploitation of children by their own family members for sexual purposes. For example, in the Philippines, we know that thousands of children are victims of live streaming sexual abuse, which is sometimes even carried out by their own parents. In one case, police found 3 girls aged 3, 7 and 11 years old lying naked on their bed and performing sexual acts. At the other end of their room was their mum and their elder sister, who was 13 years old at that time, and both of them were typing on a keyboard, interacting with 3 white men through a live webcam feed. They charged between $5 to $200 per show. It is believed that more than 10,000 kids are involved in this industry that is probably worth more than $1 billion. Sometimes entire communities or villages actually support themselves through this industry. The kids themselves who are involved and who are being sexually exploited don't think that they're being exploited at all because all their friends are doing the same thing. When they're rescued and placed in a shelter where they're thought to be safe, they don't feel gratitude, but they often feel betrayed and they want to go home. They want to go back to their families. Now, it is difficult to actually catch the people involved in this trade unless they're physically caught because there is no paper trail because most of it is conducted through live streaming. If you click on this link, you'll read more about this particular type of crime, and there is also a video where one little girl talks about her own experiences of being involved in this kind of crime. When child abuse was first investigated or researched, it was found that many of the perpetrators or abusers themselves suffered from a variety of psychological and disorders, substance abuse, mental retardation, or they themselves may have low self-esteem issues or have had poor attachment from their own childhood. Later on, researchers found out that many abusive parents were abusive simply because they didn't know how to discipline their children more effectively. Some didn't even know how to care for their child's basic needs. Therefore, it was recommended that these people actually go for parenting classes, and parenting classes or parenting skills were taught to would-be parents who are at the highest risk. There are several key concepts or differentiating factors when we look at child abuse and neglect. The first is the idea of polyvictims. Polyvictims are children who experience multiple victimizations over the course of their development. They are highly likely to develop mental health problems themselves and experience severe distress as a result of suffering from multiple forms of abuse. They are also the least likely group of victims to recover. We know that the highest victimization rate were for those who were in the 0 to 3 age group, with numbers declining as children grew older. Boys and girls are equally likely to be neglected, but girls are 4 times more likely to be sexually abused. Interestingly, spousal abuse, pet abuse, and child abuse tend to occur in the same households. We also know that there are cultural differences when we look at what child abuse is seen as or how child abuse is defined. There was a recent case where a Malaysian husband and wife were jailed by a Swedish court for smacking and caning their children. The case, which began with their arrest in December 2014, ended with them being jailed for 14 and 10 months respectively about 4 months later in April 2015. This case highlights some of the cultural differences in what is considered to be acceptable or unacceptable forms of discipline, and what is considered to be abuse or what is not considered to be abuse across cultures. If you look at this slide here, there's an excerpt from the father who says that in Malaysia, it's common to scold or cane our children a little now and then. This is probably no different from most Singaporean families. However, in Sweden, caning your child is considered corporal punishment and has been illegal since 1979, as they believe no child ever deserves a spanking, which is why these two parents were convicted of child abuse under Swedish law. The majority of children who run away from home do so to escape situations of neglect or abuse in their current home, whereas thrown away kids, on the other hand, do not run away from home but are instead asked to leave their home by their parent or guardian. Children or youth who are runaways or throwaways are at greater risk for substance abuse, as they may be influenced by their peers on the street, sexual and physical abuse, as they don't have anybody to watch out or take care of them, and they're also more likely to be exposed to crime and be involved in crime, as they see it as either a coping mechanism or a way to support themselves while they live on the streets. When we look at children who are abducted, there are two main categories of abducted children. Firstly, non-stranger abduction, which refers to situations when the child is abducted by a parent or family member. This usually happens when a family member wants to remove the child from an abusive situation where they feel that when they have no legal right, or they feel that the legal recourse would take too long to actually remove the child, and they feel the need to remove the child immediately for the child's own protection. Non-stranger abduction could also occur when parents share joint custody, or when a parent does not have custody of a child and wants to actually gain custody or gain control over the child. Stranger abduction or abduction by a non-family member, in comparison, is less frequent. However, it is usually more harmful, as the perpetrator usually takes the child through force or with threat of bodily harm, and it is defined as non-stranger abduction when a stranger has taken the child and has detained the child without authority for at least an hour. Usually stranger abductions are motivated by sexual reasons or for sexual reasons, and police records suggest that if the child is not found within the first 3 hours, the case usually doesn't end well. Another form of crime that may occur under the category of family violence is the shaken baby syndrome. The shaken baby syndrome occurs when the parent or caretaker shakes the baby so hard it results in head injuries. Experts agree that this is one of the leading killers of abused children. Even when these children do not die, many suffer from significant brain damage, resulting in lifelong conditions such as cerebral palsy or blindness. One of the main reasons this happens is because the adult is unable to control his or her anger. Most of the time, they do not mean to injure the child, but it is just an expression of their anger, which unfortunately leads to lifelong repercussions, which is why it is considered a form of abuse as well. Another form of crime that falls under the category of family violence is the Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or MSBP. MSBP occurs when the parent inflicts injury on the child and then brings him or her for medical attention. The symptoms that the child suffers from could be falsely reported or highly exaggerated by the parent. The aim of these behaviors is for the parent to receive care or sympathy from medical professionals. It's considered a crime because it often results in serious injuries to the child. In these cases, mothers are usually the offending parent, and the father is usually unaware of what is happening, and in this case, usually believes what the mother is saying as well. In most cases of MSPP, the mother herself is well versed in medical issues and may sometimes even be a medical professional. The mother is also usually over attentive during consultations. Because he or she wants the medical professional attending to the child to believe his or her case and also sympathize with him or her, in this case usually a her, for having to be the main caregiver for the child. In some cases, the family pet is the victim instead of the child. One of the more chilling cases of MSTP is the case of who killed nine of her children over a period of 10 years. After 9 deaths, suspicion finally grew against her, and there were two main reasons why the doctor in charge, or the final doctor, was suspicious about her. Firstly, one of her children was adopted, and even her adopted son died under similar circumstances as her genetic children. The doctor found this surprising is that because he died from under a similar circumstance and displayed the same symptoms even though he had no genetic link to the other children. Secondly, the doctor was also suspicious because the only person present during all 9 deaths was the mother. He reported his suspicions to the police, and Mary Beth later confessed to the crimes. She was sentenced to 22 years to life in prison. When questioned and asked, "Why did you do what you did?" she said, "I just can't remember. I know I did it, but I can't tell you why. There's no real reason." If you watch this video, it's quite long. It's about 40 minutes. It actually examines the case of Mary Beth Tinnings in more detail. It looks at her history, possible motivations for what she did, and it also gives some psychological explanations for why she did it. Another category of crime that falls under family violence is infanticide, which is a form of child homicide when a person intentionally kills a child or infant with the aim of causing death. Every year, between 1,200 to 1,500 infants and children are killed by their own parents. And the term infanticide is specifically used to refer to a crime when an infant or child is murdered by his or her own parents. There are two types of infanticide. Firstly, is what is termed as neonaticide, which refers to the killing of newborns within 24 hours of birth. Research suggests that neonaticide is thought to be a reaction of parents to dispose of a problem. There is little research to support that these parents actually have a psychological disorder, although some women who commit this act did display bizarre behaviors such as breastfeeding the dead infant and driving around with the dead infant in the car. In terms of their personality, they're usually submissive, immature, passive, and childlike in nature. Most offenders of this crime actually have no psychological problems, or neither do they have criminal records. Often, the infant is killed because they are unable to care for the infant, or they don't want people to know that they have actually given birth to a child. Filicide, on the other hand, is the killing of children after 24 hours of birth. It is usually committed by mothers, especially when they are the main caregivers, and is thought to be a result of postnatal depression or because they were feeling overwhelmed. Unlike mothers who commit neonaticide, many of the mothers who commit filicide were found to be psychotic and suffering from either depression or postpartum depression. About 40% of them also have previous records, but these acts of filicide usually don't involve weapons and are instead acts of omission. For example, death due to not monitoring the child in a dangerous environment, or acts of commission, for example, delivering a swift blow to the child in an effort to silence a crying or wailing child. Another category of family violence is intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence covers physical, psychological, and sexual violence within the context of intimate personal relationships. These relationships may include same-sex relationships and dating relationships as well. That is, they do not have to be heterosexual relationships or relationships where the two people are married. These acts are also sometimes referred to as domestic violence, and most of crimes are committed by men against women. That is, the man is the perpetrator and the woman is the victim. Very often, men use weapons or fists in order to inflict pain and injury on their victims. Few of these relationships actually get better over time, although many women continue to remain in the relationship because in the hope of the relationship getting better. Very few leave, and others may actually end up being killed by their abusive partners. Consequence of intimate partner violence is actually the battered wife syndrome. In the past, many people believed that battered women allow themselves to be battered, and it was viewed as a single behavioral disorder displayed by all victims. However, recent research suggests that many of these so-called victims do display survival and adaptation skills, and it is not a disorder. Instead, many now consider it to be a form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Many of these women are also passive and highly dependent on their partners. Therefore, the battered wife syndrome is sometimes now seen as a form of survival and adaptation, and not really a disorder in itself. Within the context of intimate partner violence, another issue that has been recently coming up very often is the issue of same-sex domestic violence. This is an issue that has been increasingly receiving more attention from both researchers as well as the general public. Many researchers have found similarities in the violent cycles and stages of abuse observed in same-sex domestic violence cases as in heterosexual relationships. As the prevalence of same-sex marriages increase, there will probably be an increased need to understand these issues and to provide relevant intervention programs. Another area of concern is there are not many services or programs that are actually targeted at victims of same-sex domestic violence. One reason for this could possibly be because not many are willing to come forward to actually ask for help, and within the context of more traditional societies, it is unlikely that funding is allocated towards such programs. In extreme cases, intimate partner violence actually ends up in death. In such cases, it is termed mate homicide. Research has found that there are several motives for mate homicide. As you can see from the pie chart here, possessiveness makes up the motive for almost 50% of these crimes. Many of these incidences are also correlated with alcohol abuse, where the abusive husband or father is seen as irrational. He or she may also be frustrated and have he, usually not she, is usually also often frustrated and has anger management problems. However, alcohol use However, it's important to note that alcohol abuse is not the cause of maid homicide, but instead it just exacerbates the problem. Sometimes maid homicide is also a result of the victim trying to defend herself against the perpetrator, in which cases it is considered an act of self-defense. Another almost 25% of cases are actually considered to be crimes of passion, because they are actions that happen on the spur of the moment as a result of feelings arising from arguments. In the case of intimate partner violence, research has identified three categories of intimate partner batterers. The characteristics of each type of batterer is summarized in the table above. The most common type of batterer is actually type 1 batterers, where the perpetrator abuses family members. Usually the abuse is not as violent or extensive or as intensive, and the perpetrator is usually very remorseful for his actions after the incident is over. Type 2 batterers, on the other hand, are perpetrators who abuse their family members due to their own emotional problems. For example, they may have problems regulating their emotions, or they themselves may be depressed. Some also have symptoms of personality disorders that makes it difficult for them to control their actions. The third category of batterers is type 3 batterers, who are perpetrators who display many other antisocial behaviors. They may also have criminal tendencies and have a record of being involved in crimes. They're also likely to abuse substances, and they may also be violent in other areas. It's in the sense they may be involved in fights outside the home, and their violent actions are then targeted not just towards their family members, but towards other people in general as well. We're going to look at a different category that comes under the overarching topic of family violence, and that is elder abuse. Elder abuse is defined as the infliction of harm, and harm in this case could be physical, emotional, or psychological, on people aged 65 years or older. It usually involves the victim being injured, neglected, or exploited due to vulnerabilities associated with his or her age. These vulnerabilities could include decline in physical or mental capacities. It may also be a combination of interpersonal violence, for example, spousal or child abuse, but with specific reference to aging problems. In America, about over 2 million older Americans are victims of abuse every year. This type of abuse is quickly becoming an area of concern for Singapore, as we have an increasingly larger elder population, coupled with the fact that many families have fewer children. At least within the Singapore context, many cases go unreported, as many elderly parents are reluctant to report their own children for elder abuse. Elder abuse could also be defined as the refusal to fulfill a person's responsibilities towards an elder. This includes the refusal or failure to provide food, water, clothing, shelter, and medicine. One type of elder abuse that is often less acknowledged and even less reported is the over-medicating of adults in nursing homes to subdue them or to get them to be more passive within the context of a nursing home. Um, we know that cases of elder abuse are usually a result of troubled family dynamics and interpersonal processes. Often, these already troubled family dynamics and interpersonal processes become even more volatile when the dependency relationship is altered, either because the elder person becomes ill or there are financial issues within the family. The main perpetrators of elder abuse are often relatives, which is why the example of elder abuse occurring in nursing homes is usually less common. These relatives often feel trapped. They may feel like they lack the resources to support the elder, and some may even abuse substances themselves. These factors or a combination of these factors make it difficult for them to care for the elderly. Another category of perpetrators within the context of elder abuse is spouses. Usually, it is the male spouse who is more likely to physically abuse the elderly, his or her elderly wife, whereas a female spouse is more likely to psychologically abuse her male spouse. Within the context of families, both men and women are equally likely to exploit an elderly family member financially. This next slide shows the percentage of reported crimes related to elder abuse in the US. As you can see, neglect of the elderly actually makes up the highest proportion of the type of elderly abuse, which comes up to almost 60%. Sexual abuse is the least common type of elder abuse, making up less than 0.05%. Let's now move on to the next category of family violence. This time we'll be looking at sibling to sibling violence. This type of violence is often overlooked in families, as it is usually put down to simple sibling rivalry or part of the normal developmental process. Often it is not taken very seriously because it is thought to be normal behavior. However, in extreme cases, it can lead to serious harm. Parents also are likely to downplay such instances to keep up the idea of having a happy family. Rarely, but importantly, this type of violence may sometimes go beyond normal sibling rivalry and can include detrimental behaviors such as punching, choking, assaulting, or threatening with or the actual use of a weapon. Sibling to sibling violence often spills over to violence in other relationships. For example, a sibling who victimizes his or her sibling is likely to also victimize his or her romantic partner or be the perpetrator in situations of family violence in adulthood. Often, younger siblings are the victims of serious sibling to sibling violence. Some of the key terms associated with sibling to sibling violence are featured on this slide. The first is siblicide, where one sibling kills another sibling. Siblicide is further categorized in two categories, where you've got sororicide, where a sister is the victim and is killed, or fratricide, where the brother is the victim and is killed. Another category of family violence that is not often discussed is child-to-parent violence. This form of violence is also often overlooked, even though it does make up a significant proportion of family murders, standing at about 25% of family murders in the US. Children involved in this type of offense can be categorized into three main areas. Firstly, the severely abused child who feels the need to seek revenge or protect himself against a parent who is a perpetrator. The mentally or the severely mentally ill child who may not understand the consequences of his actions. And finally, the dangerous antisocial child who may kill a parent in order to meet his or her own goals, or because she or he sees the parent as somebody who is blocking him or her from achieving his or her own goals. Most of these violent incidents are associated with conflicts about home responsibility, money, and the child's privileges, for example, in terms of freedom. Some of the key terms associated with child-parent violence is shown on this slide. Parricide is the term used when a child kills both his parents. Matricide is the term used to describe incidences where the child kills his or her mother. And patricide is used to describe crimes where the child kills his or her father. Statistics suggest that sons are more likely to commit child-parent violence, whether it is parricide, matricide, or patricide, and mothers are more likely to become the victims. When daughters are the perpetrators, they often do not act alone, but instead secure the help of a male friend or sibling. Although sons dominate in extreme forms of family violence, the gender differences in these type of crimes are not as obvious when we examine as compared to more moderate forms of violence. The graph on this slide shows the number of murders by family relationships. As you can see, parricide is more often committed by sons compared to daughters. Finally, we will look at multi-assaultive families. Multi-assaultive families are defined as families which are characterized by the continual cycles of physical aggression and violence. For example, it could include cases where siblings hit each other, spouses hit each other, parents hit their children, and older children hit their parents, all within the context of one family. Persons involved in this kind of violence are also likely to be violent outside the family environment, and children from these families are likely to be involved in other crimes such as property crime. They also have difficulties in adjusting to school and engage or interact more with deviant peers. According to the cycle of violence hypothesis, individuals who grow up in a family or in an environment where there is family violence are likely to grow up to be abusive themselves as a result of the abuse they themselves experience. The coercion development theory, which we looked at under the topic of juvenile delinquency, for example, supports this idea by proposing that punitive or overly harsh parenting styles lead to children modeling these behaviors as adults and practicing aggressiveness and being the perpetrators of domestic violence themselves. However, some researchers differ as they argue that these theories are actually overly simplistic and that violence does not always lead to more violence. They suggest that sometimes the opposite is likely to take place, as victims of abuse may be even more sensitive to the psychological and social cost of family violence. They may make an even more conscious effort to not commit aggressive acts themselves. And this brings us to the end of today's lecture. Next week we will continue about look at it within the context and if you have any questions on this week's lecture, please feel free to approach me or your tutor. Thank you.